So as a mediator, I am constantly asked, my wedding planning is turning into a complete disaster and I am ready to throw in the towel. Can you help, please? So if you're in the throes of planning a wedding, either as a bride or a groom or a parent or a sibling or a beloved friend, and you're finding yourself up to your eyeballs in tension, then this video is for you. So by the end of this video, you're going to have 6 concrete tips on how to deal with wedding conflict adroitly and ensure that you make it to this wedding in one piece with your soul intact and joy on your heart. So I think we all know, right? Planning a wedding can be a minefield of conflict. People have different religious traditions and different views about how important that should be. People have very different sized families and different ideas of how extended the invitation should be. People get into battles about who should be seated next to whom and how much money to spend and what the wedding party should look like. And so the more you think about it, right, you're like, this is really, really complicated. And so the first thing I want to say is it's really important to normalize the tension, to normalize the fact that there is a lot of conflict here. I have been at many weddings. I have helped people plan for many weddings. I have even officiated many weddings. I have never been involved in a wedding where there isn't a substantial amount of conflict going on either above the surface or below the surface. So what is the advantage of normalizing? I think it just takes away some of the shame and guilt that people feel when there's tension around a wedding. And I think shame and guilt come up because we say, oh, weddings are supposed to be joyful, and weddings are supposed to be a time when we're coming together for the rest of our lives and our families are coming together. And so anything that doesn't feel easy and joyful can feel like a source of shame. But the truth of the matter, right, is that a wedding is one of the biggest days in the life of the people who are getting married. But here's the other thing. There have been a lot of people in that person's life who have been thinking about this day for a very, very long time. And some of them have been thinking about the wedding longer than you have if you're one of the people getting married. And often these people have very strong views about what it should look like and what it should not look like. You know, it's funny, I am still single, but I attend many weddings. And whenever I come home from a wedding, my mom will ask me this, it's almost always the same question. She'll say, what was the wedding favor? And much of the time, I'll say something like, well, they didn't have a wedding favor. And then she'll say in this somewhat indignant tone, I never heard of such a thing. And I always kind of have an internal smile around this, right? Because like clearly my mom feels strongly that there should be a wedding favor at a wedding. Now, she has not had to be involved in a wedding for me, but I can imagine that if I ever got married, that either I would have some conflict about a wedding favor or we would in fact have a wedding favor. Point is, right, conflict is normal. Once you kind of just own that, the second step I want to suggest is that you need to have your own internal negotiation that relates to both what's appropriate for your role in the wedding and what your interests are. So if you're the bride or groom, you have a different role than if you are a parent or sibling or friend. Now, all of you may have some interests in terms of what's important to you and what isn't important to you. But I think you need to think about what those interests are and then calibrate it appropriately to the role that you have in this particular wedding. But if you are one of the people getting married, one of the things I really want to invite you to think about as you think about your interests is the degree to which you see the wedding as being primarily about you and your spouse, or as something that is about you and your spouse, but also for your parents and your family and your friends. Because I would say that often where a lot of the conflict comes up is this tension between what do we want, the two people who are entering into this marriage, and then what are the expectations and hopes of everybody else. The more in your own internal conversation, your internal negotiation, you can clarify what those boundaries are and where you're willing to negotiate and where you're willing to say no, I think the easier it's going to be to actually move forward in this particular planning. So third, once you've made that decision, I think it can be really helpful to seek to preserve at least some autonomy for all of the main stakeholders involved. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you're one of the members of the couple who are getting married, you may say to yourself, here's a bunch of things that are really important to us. But if you have a parent who wants to have some control over something, giving some specific domain to that parent and saying, within this domain, you have plenary authority, plenary autonomy, can be incredibly helpful. So I have seen, for example, a parent trying to control an invitation list, and it could become really poisonous. But if in advance you say to a parent, listen, we have 20 invitations for you to invite your own friends, and within those 20 invitations, do whatever you want. Now, maybe the parent wants 30 people, but at least giving them some autonomy is really helpful instead of saying, I'm going to need to inspect each of those 20 people. And part of the reason why this matters is human beings in general, we like to have some autonomy and we like to have autonomy respected. And so if there's a way that I can give stakeholders a bit of that in a wedding plan, that will go a long way. Fourth, once I've thought these things through, that's when I need to actually initiate some difficult conversations, particularly after I've done an interest assessment and I see that some of the interests just simply aren't aligning. So a difficult conversation around a wedding is always fraught, but sometimes there are some opportunities to create some value. So that can be done sometimes by expanding the time frame. So let me give you an example. Two of my friends are in the process of getting married. Now that may sound strange. What do you mean by in the process? Well, here's why it's a little strange. They actually have gotten married in a church and they are legally married. However, their wedding is in September. This may sound weird to you, but what they realized is that the two of them wanted a very small ceremony with a strong religious component with their close family and friends only. However, their parents wanted a ginormous big party. And so what they were able to do is actually do both, right? They're expanding the time frame, and they purposely expanded the time frame so that the religious ceremony of the wedding could be celebrated and held on its own, and then several months later, the big party. I'll give you another example. I officiated a wedding between two of my friends where one of the partners was Jewish and the other was Christian. And we were able to integrate some aspects of both Judaism and Christianity into the ceremony, but on the Jewish side of the family, they actually wanted more events that felt like it honored the Jewish side. And so this couple was able to create a number of events that were adjacent to the real wedding, but that had more of a Jewish flair to it. The point of the matter is, right, there are ways that you can often create value within, create value by expanding the time frame and thinking out of the box. Now, this leads to my fifth important piece of advice, because the truth is that there are some things that simply you can't create value on. And that's when I want to really strongly encourage you in the difficult conversation to use active listening skills, particularly around the emotions of the parties and the identity questions that might come up in the conversation. Because I think around weddings, right, it's often not just what we're going to do, but it's the meaning making behind those things. Are you honoring the family or betraying the family? Do you care about what grandma thinks or not? Did I raise you well? Those conversations can be incredibly hard to have, and so instead, we fight about something like what song is going to be played, or is someone going to walk down the aisle using the wedding dress from 1956? that's usually not at what's the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is the meaning making. And so the more you could listen really actively, find ways to acknowledge the identity questions and the emotions, the easier this will go. 6, because it's a wedding and because it's important, people are going to mess up. And so the more you can go into this being liberal with 2 things, a willingness to apologize and a willingness to forgive, the better it's going to be. So let's review 6 pieces of advice on how to handle conflict around a wedding. First, normalize the tension. If it's a wedding, there's going to be conflict. Welcome. Second, have your own internal negotiation about your interests in this negotiation and manage your own expectations that are appropriate to the role that you have in the wedding. Third, if possible, seek to preserve some autonomy for the other stakeholders who have interests in this wedding. Fourth, in advance, initiate difficult conversations, particularly around the interests that don't align. As you do that, look for opportunities to create value. Fifth, work hard to listen actively, particularly around strongly held emotions and identity issues. And lastly, be generous with apologizing and be generous with forgiveness because mistakes are going to happen. So, from weddings to graduation, watch this next Clash course on graduation conflict. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and ring the bell so you never miss new content from me. Okay, click, click, click.